Some of you have been present since this morning, so I have to welcome them back. And many of you have come for this lecture, so I want to welcome you. I want to welcome you all to this third C.R. Parekh Memorial Lecture organized by the Parekh Institute of Indian Thought. Just a few words about the Institute. This Institute was set up in 2013 thanks to a very generous endowment from Nirman Foundation, a foundation that was set up by Sri C.R. Parekh and managed by Mr. Parekh's sons, Professor Parekh, also Lord Parekh, and a very eminent political philosopher, internationally known political philosopher, and his brother, to honor their father. And it was only thanks to Bhikkhubai's deep personal interest in political philosophy, social philosophy, that such a grant was made available to us at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, and we set up this. It's really a project of the Center, but it has a slightly more fancy title, Institute of Thought, and it's an institute which is set up exclusively to study Indian thought, and particularly those traditions of Indian thought that many of us, when we were getting educated, for whatever reason, which I really can't go into, were deprived of studying deeply. So we thought that this institute would give us an opportunity to learn about these traditions and to be able to study various texts in ancient Indian political and social thought in particular, but thought more generally. Now, a lot of people might have wondered at that time, and may still wonder, why, what's so special about this? Because after all, there has been a very rich tradition of Indian social and political thought, and from the middle of the 19th to the middle of the 20th century, for about 100 years, all the giants of the anti-colonial struggle were very familiar with these traditions and with these with the classical texts. I don't think that our whole anti-colonial struggle would have been possible if they didn't have this major influence. So, why are we making so much fuss about it? And the reason for that is that, as I said, in the post-independent era, I think for the first 30 years or so, I think there was something just went wrong. At least that's what I believe. Something went wrong, and these traditions were not as readily available to us as they should have been, and so that's one of the reasons why, as I said, we. But there was another moment which is extremely important. I mentioned this in the morning, and that is that although there is a challenge to Western intellectual hegemony has been there for a very long time, and I mentioned Swaraj, a very major text written by Gandhi in 1909, which really provides a very deep challenge to and a critique of the modern West, I think it's only now that we are beginning to see that a real effective challenge to that hegemony. It's not just a few thinkers here and a few thinkers there, the great ones who are developing this. I think in the last 30 years, the academic world itself has seen some changes, and we are all now beginning to rethink a whole variety of concepts and categories that we have received, both from our tradition and from Western traditions, and we've been thinking anew, afresh about these issues. So, let me just say something about the activities that Parekh Institute does. The mandate for us is that we will study at least for some time. We will study ancient Indian texts and address certain questions to them, which perhaps the great contemporary scholars don't routinely ask. Questions which are very important to us as contemporary social and political theorists. So we thought that we should have a meeting of political theorists and social scientists on the one hand, and some of the best scholars of ancient Indian texts written in Pali and in Sanskrit, and we will come together and collectively read these texts over a period of time, 4 to 6 weeks at least. And so we were very fortunate in the first year to have Professor Patrick Oliver. He's here with us, a renowned scholar of Sanskrit, and there were 2 other scholars who came with him, Professor Tim Lubin and Professor Marg, and some of us from the center, and these 3 scholars, we met over a period of 6 to 8 weeks, and we read Arthashastra, large passages from the Manav Dharma Shastra in the first year, and we gained immensely from reading such texts. We had stereotypes about some ways of thinking and about what they were trying to do, and the reading with such eminent scholars helped us to dismantle these stereotypes, and we had a very fruitful encounter with these texts. In the second year, we had 3 other scholars come, Larry McRae from Cornell, Ajay Rao from Toronto, and Chris Minkowski from Oxford. These 3 scholars, we read certain texts on social exclusion. The theme of the first was broadly, you can say, social order, religio-philosophical diversity, how to theory of statecraft, how states handle these diversities. But in the second set of readings that we did, where we had sections from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and some Mimamsic texts, such as the Shabara Bhashya, the theme then was social exclusion, social marginalization. So we looked at the dialogue between the hunter and the Brahmin in the Mahabharata. We examined Ekalavya, the story, Shambhuka, the whole discourse on Shabari, and so on, to look at how in the ancient texts people, those people who wrote those texts looked at women, Dalits, tribals, and that too was a extremely fruitful encounter. At this time, of course, we have had a different theme, the ends of human life, and the way we're doing exactly the same thing, except that our group is a little larger, thanks to a very generous grant from the Berggruen Institute. So we've had some scholars from scholars of ancient Chinese traditions come with us. Professor David Wong is one of them. Professor Roger Ames, Lee Chen Young, and Daniel Bell, and we also have Parekh come once again, and Jean Schleiter from Bern, and John Davis from University of Texas, and during the course of one whole month we've been reading various texts, and there's been a very fruitful exchange between Chinese and Indian scholars, and hopefully thanks to those reading sessions as well as the workshop that we are having since this morning over 3 days, we'll be able to produce our first volume in the next 2-3 years, which will be a comparative study of ancient Indian and Chinese thought. So, so this has been, I think there's one word for what we've been, at least what I feel, over these last 3 years, and this encounter has been exhilarating, and we've really had a terrific time. Okay, so our first lecture, C.R. Parekh Memorial Lecture, was given by Professor Patrick Oliver. Our second lecture was given by Christopher Minkowski, and our third lecture this evening is given by my friend and colleague David Wong. David is Susan Fox Beischer and George D. Beischer, Professor of Philosophy at Duke University. He had earned his PhD from Princeton, and he has been a professor before he joined Duke University. He was a professor at Brandeis and at Boston University. His main interest, and for which he's widely known, internationally known, is the study of moral diversity, of looking at the nature and extent of moral similarities and moral differences across different societies. So both internal moral diversity, internal to society, as well as diversity across societies, across cultures, and the impact that has had on the way we think about morality, whether morality is an objective system, or whether it leads us in the direction of relativism. So it's that conundrum and that dilemma that has occupied David for quite some time. He has attempted to understand morality naturalistically. He thinks that that you can explain a lot of you can explain the emergence of morality and the and some of the nature and content of morality in different parts of the world, despite all the differences, by reference to a common human condition, by common structures of society, structures of both cooperation and conflict. He's also looked at how moral conflict has to be confronted and possibly resolved, how disagreements have to be handled by deliberation or by negotiation or by non-rational and more mimetic methods such as rituals He's looked at the relationship between rituals and emotional life. And he's done all this as a contemporary moral philosopher, but he's always relied on both Chinese philosophy, Confucianism and Taoism on the one hand, but also on evolutionary psychology, on cognitive psychology, evolutionary biology, with neurosciences. So he combines both of them, and in fact, there is some interesting similarities that there are between what the Confucian tradition says, or more the Taoist tradition says, and some of the recent findings of the natural sciences. So he's really a comparative philosopher, a comparative moral philosopher, and it's a real honor to have him here and to give the third C.R. Parekh lecture. So, David, the floor is yours.
Is this on? Do I?
It's on.
It's on. Yeah.
It's on.
It's on.
It's on. Okay. Okay. Let me know if the volume is sufficient. No.
Bring it a little closer to you.
A little closer. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Well, I shall try to live up to the honor of delivering the C.R. Parekh lecture, and simply to introduce my colleague and friend.
Closer. You are trailing off because it.
I'm trailing off.
Pull it towards it.
You know who I am. Don't like it, blame the guy over here. Better?
Do the mic.
All right. Okay. And being introduced by my colleague and friend, Rajeev Bhargava. This lecture also has special meaning because I have read and benefited from Lord Bhikkhu Parekh's work on multiculturalism. And so I didn't know initially that C.R. Parekh was Bhikkhu Parekh's father. Father, yes. So it's an added delight for me to be here. And thank you for coming. So, my subject is this question: is the ancient Confucian ideal of he, harmony, a viable ideal in pluralistic societies composed of people and groups who subscribe to different ideals of the good and moral life? Is harmony compatible with accepting, even encouraging difference and the freedom to think differently? This evening I start with seminal characterizations of harmony in Confucian texts. I then aim to chart ways harmony and freedom can be compatible and even mutually supportive, while recognizing the constant possibility of conflict between them. The Confucian notion of harmony is quite like some ancient Indian conceptions, and I will discuss Ashoka's conception in particular. Annexe 930 provides some revealing detail on why we must accept the inevitability of difference. This translation happens to be by Roger Ames and Henry Rosemont. It was you, Roger. It was Henry. You're Henry. The master said, "You can study with some and yet not necessarily walk the same path, Tao. You can walk the same path as some and yet not necessarily take your stand with them. You can take your stand with them and yet not necessarily weigh things up in the same way." So the journey to ethical excellence is long. One begins with studying, 学, then embarking on a path such as Confucius's Tao of Ren, we translate as human-heartedness, appropriateness, Yi, and ritual propriety, Li. Then taking a stand, Li, by assuming a social position and performing the ritual activities appropriate to that position. And finally, to exercising judgment by weighing, qian, multiple considerations that arise in a situation. Okay? Have you been hearing me?
Yeah.
Okay. We should not miss, however, the passage's message that our journey is with others and that we should expect to differ with them even as we jointly pursue the realization of our shared aspirations. Weighing is a matter of judging how ethical considerations stack up against each other, especially when they conflict. Confucius is here recognizing, I think, that reasonable people can judge differently given their value priorities and unique fund of experiences in life. Annexe 1323 points to a conception of harmony that goes beyond mere acceptance of difference. The exemplary person pursues harmony rather than sameness, tung. The small person does the opposite. The contrast between harmony and sameness indicates that harmony makes constructive use of difference. How so? The Zuojuan, commentary of Zuo, contains a speech that is often invoked to amplify the Annexe remark about harmony. The speech is attributed to Yan Ying, a high minister known for his frank advice to the ruling family of the state of Qi. The Duke of Qi says to Yan Ying that only one minister in his retinue is in harmony with him. It's a little bit like Trump complaining about all this. Master Yan responds that this minister, only seeks tung, sameness, or conformity with him. When the Duke asks what is the difference between harmony and sameness, Master Yan offers analogies to soup and to music. I will here focus on soup since I'm a better cook than a musician. I have to admit I'm a little bit disappointed to learn that soup is not a big item in Indian cuisine. So I hope some of you at least have had some Chinese meals out. You know? So the soup in question has meat or fish and vegetables. This particular one, fish. Because meat or fish has a strong flavor, it needs to be balanced by and mingled with other flavors. Vinegar, sauce, salt, and plum in water and over a wood fire. Accordingly, the ruler does not simply listen to a minister who seeks sameness with him. That would be like adding more water to a watery soup. If a ruler's view about a matter has something wrong with it, a minister should point it out, as well as whatever might be right about his view. The metaphor of soup gives rise to important questions about the nature of harmony. A ruler should seek ministers with different points of view who can help him see the different facets of an issue. They should seek to integrate their different perspectives into a constructive whole that is greater than the simple sum. But what more specifically is this greater whole like? In what manner are those differences integrated? Does integration always eliminate disagreement? There are times when the minister and ruler can integrate their different points of view into a stronger and more comprehensive point of view. Certainly this is one dimension of any kind of harmony worth striving for. Let me call it the dimension of shared understanding. But of what, ultimately, is this shared understanding? I think they must be guided by a shared vision of what sort of society they want to realize through governance. Confucius expresses the heart of this vision in a beautifully simple way after having asked his students, Zilu and Yan Hui, what they would most like to accomplish. They ask Confucius what his answer would be, and he replies, I would like to bring peace and contentment to the aged, to share relationships of trust and confidence with my friends, and to love and protect the young. The shared understanding as expressed here consists in common striving for relationships of concern, respect, and trust by people who know others well enough to engage accurately what they need given their circumstances and who are trustworthy and competent enough to deliver it. The ideal of harmony rests on the assumption that our great good as individual human beings lies in having relationships of this kind with each other, and accordingly posits a fundamental compatibility between the most important interests of individuals. The interpretation of the ideal is to be distinguished from the common interpretation that the individual's interests must be subordinated to the group or community or society. When social scientists and cultural psychologists began studying moralities that gave rise to an ideal such as harmony, they misleadingly, I think, called them collectivist, followed by a definition that mentions subordination of the individual to the group. And it's not just outsiders who adhere to such an interpretation. Those who purport to represent the interests of the group, community, and society, but who wish to silence and suppress those who disrupt harmony, often misappropriate the language of harmony to justify what they do. As David Hall and Roger Ames have pointed out, the concept of subordinating the individual to the group presupposes that the individual exists apart from the social and then is subordinated to it. Instead, Hall and Ames assert the absence of such separation in Chinese thought. This philosophical point dovetails with findings by cultural and social psychologists and anthropologists to the effect that in different parts of Asia, people have a greater tendency to understand individuals in terms of the relationships they have with others and the context of their activities. The tendency to understand individuals in relational terms suggests that they cannot be conceived as fully separate from any group that supposedly subordinates them. Others in one's group may already be a part of the self. This conception of the person as overlapping in identity with others has normative implications for what constitutes the good of the individual and how that good relates to the good of others. Relationship with others can form a part of one's good as an individual. One can have a compelling interest in their welfare and in one's relationship with them. In Confucian ethics, the paradigm of this interdependence of individuals and their goods is the morally healthy family, where the good of each individual includes and overlaps with the good of others. When one family member flourishes, so do the others. But what, it may be asked, is to be done in cases where an individual's interests come into conflict with those of other members. One picture that can be derived from Confucian texts is a continual process of balancing and negotiation between the interests of individuals and those of the others to whom the individual is related. Negotiation is carried on in the light of the interdependence of individuals and the various communities to which they belong, and the interdependence of the goods towards which they aim. An individual's interests may sometimes have to yield to the interests of others, and partial compensation for yielding is that a central part of one's good lies in relationship with others. On the other hand, the good of the family, for example, cannot be achieved without consideration of an individual's important interests. If those interests are urgent and weighty, they must become important interests of the family, and can sometimes have priority in case of conflict. Sometimes members must split the differences and compromise. Sometimes yielding to others, sometimes must be balanced against having priority at other times. In thinking what to do about conflicts, we are guided by the thought that our own good involves the good of others and our relationships to them. Consider the story from 5A2 of the Mencius or Mengzi as an illustration of these points. Stories of Shun, the sage king, present him as an exemplar to those aspiring to live the Confucian Tao or way. When Shun wanted to get married, it was at a time in his relationship to his parents when he knew that were he to ask permission, he would be denied. He decided to marry anyway without telling them. Ordinarily and extraordinarily unfilial act. But Mencius defends what Shun did, saying that if Shun had let his parents deny him the most important of human relationships, it would have embittered him toward his parents. What is Mencius' reasoning? Shun's good as an individual depends on both his desired marriage relationship and his relationship to his parents. For him to conform to his parents' wishes is not only to deny him the first relationship, but to adversely affect the second, even more so. than if he had conformed to, asked them and conformed. If he had even more so than if he, in fact, did what he did. So for the sake of both relationships, he must assert his own good, which in the end is not separate from the good of his parents. Thus, harmony refers to this activity of harmonizing that requires continuous mutual adjustment of the interests of individuals to each other. Balancing and reconciling the interests of individuals is a matter of Chan, or weighing, discretion. What constitutes a satisfactory adjustment cannot be specified independently of the particular interests at stake and the present and future nature of the relationships of all the relevant parties. Had less been at stake for Shun, it might not have been appropriate for him to avoid asking permission. Had his parents better reason to deny him permission, it might have not been for Shun to have done what he did. And so he's making soup and adjusting the balance of flavors when something about the soup is not quite right. It's got to be a tasting of that particular soup that shapes what you do, not the recipe. So far, I've presented the dimension of shared agreement and valuing of relationships of mutual concern and responsiveness to need in terms of Confucian ethics, with an implied contrast between societies of Asia on the one hand and societies of Western Europe and North America on the other. The latter societies have been said to emphasize the conception of individuals as independent of their relationships to each other, and moreover to value the defense of individual interests against encroachment of others. But I think this cultural contrast needs complication. The interdependence ingredient in the cultural soup is found in many societal kitchens, with the varied proportions relative to the ingredient of independence. Some philosophers, such as Li Changyang, have noticed a resonance between the relationally oriented Confucian ethics and relationally oriented ethics that have been associated with women in the US by theorists such as Carol Gilligan and Nell Noddings. The cultural psychologists Hazel Rose Marcus and Elena Connor identify a pervasive variation in the extent to which people conceive of themselves as independent or interdependent, and in how much they value independence versus interdependence. They identify this variation not only between the West and Asia, but everywhere, between men and women, between different socioeconomic classes, races and ethnicities, and regions of a single country, such as the West tending towards independence and South tending towards interdependence in the United States. They conclude that even in cultures and groups that emphasize independence, there typically is some basis for recognizing and valuing interdependence and looking for a common good one shares with others. Some recognition that independence as a trait is nurtured within the right sort of relationships. This complication of the original cultural contrast illustrates the important fact that our most important moral disagreements with each other often involve differences in the priorities assigned to values that we share and that mutually support as well exist in tension with one another. Harmony as shared understanding and the valuing of relationship is not a culturally localized value. This has not been recognized as it should, partly due to the stereotypical association of harmony with the collectivism that subordinates the individual to the group, instead of pointing to a conception of the individual as interdependent, relational, and whose good is tied to the good of others. Well, we might imagine that Shun's parents did not accept the rightness of his getting married after they learned about it, but eventually they got over it, partly because Shun seemed to have been particularly skilled in getting people to work together, including his parents with him, I guess. And not uncommonly, parents eventually get over what they first think they cannot accept from their children. Take that from experience. But not that often. Good thing our daughter is here. Moreover, it is in the spirit of Annexe 930 to accept that disagreement and judgment on several levels, is an enduring and ubiquitous feature of our journey with others. If achieving harmony with others is contingent on reaching complete agreement with them, harmony will never be forthcoming in this life. There are forms of harmony that are not dependent on agreement. Family members and friends can love one another and vigorously disagree. Their agreement and their shared projects on other matters can form the context in which their vigorous disagreements do not threaten the bonds between them. Even affinities between people can contribute to such a context in which even deep disagreements do not threaten the relationship. I have called accommodation the dimension of harmony that strives for a constructive relationship in the face of continuing disagreement. Accommodation, as I conceive it, is itself a moral value. It is a second-order value in that it presupposes first-order moral disagreement. Accommodation expresses respect and concern for disagreeing others. As a value, it has different facets. It includes an epistemic openness to expand one's conception of the good and the right upon further understanding and appreciation of other ways of life. A willingness to act on one's own moral positions in ways that minimize or at least reduce potential damage to one's broader relationship to others who have opposed positions, and a willingness to at least sometimes compromise on what one might have achieved in realizing one's moral position for the sake of sustaining a broader relationship to disagreeing others. Accommodation as a moral value is required by a plausible conception of morality, for which I have argued, as having the function of structuring and promoting social cooperation. To promote cooperation, societies foster a degree of convergence on moral values, but given the ubiquity of disagreement over how to interpret and prioritize shared values, there must be some will to stay in constructive relationship when convergence is absent. Otherwise, cooperation is subject to crippling breakdown, as we are now witnessing in the US, where critical problems such as climate change, immigration, alarming inequality, and eroding national infrastructure remain drastically underaddressed or not at all addressed. Besides the inherent difficulties of settling questions of value interpretation and prioritization, there is structural reason for the ubiquity of disagreement and thus the need for accommodation. The reason is that human societies are exceptional in the scale and complexity of cooperation achieved, where people of different types of specialized skills and cognitive and affective dispositions work together by coordinating through their different roles. Specialization of psychological type and role often brings with it difference in value orientation that produces disagreements. These differences in orientation make societies much more versatile than they would be otherwise, allowing their members to develop talents and skills along specialized channels that meet different kinds of challenges as they arise. Therefore, social cooperation creates pressures for both convergence and divergence in moral orientation, and the complex mixture of commonality and difference in actual moralities reflects these pressures. The combination is both a shared moral value and is an important resort where divergence on other values threatens to undermine social bonds. So these then are the dimensions of harmony I have identified. Integration of difference, shared understandings, and accommodation. Let me address an anticipated objection to the way I've argued for the integration of difference and accommodation in a notion of Confucian harmony. I have cited textual passages from the Annexe and Mueller that support such integration, but it may be objected from a number of quarters that the weight of Confucianism as it developed is far more heavily towards the assumption of shared understanding rather than the accommodation of difference, with the conception of shared understanding heavily shaped by an elite who believed it held a correct understanding to be shared. Moreover, that shared understanding often involves a hierarchy where the interests of some were much more liable to be accommodated than the interests of others. Now, I don't quarrel with the historical judgment that this has often turned out to be the case. My quotations from the canonical Confucian texts are meant to indicate a direction of development that was less frequently, perhaps, and less firmly institutionalized, for reasons that I think do not concern the ethical merits of that direction. With that said, I know of no society that is able to function without some kinds and degrees of hierarchy, differentials in power and authority in various social and political domains. The question is what kind and how it is legitimated, and what practices and institutional means are set in place to assure that that differential in power and authority is used correctly. I would also argue that not only do the early Confucian texts point in a direction of significant accommodation of difference, but also that the Chinese tradition as a whole provides a corrective to those less accommodating and hierarchical tendencies of institutionalized Confucianism that are unhealthy and abusive of power. Taoism provides one such corrective. In both the Tao Te Ching and Zhuangzi, there is a call to realize our epistemic limitations, to realize how greatly one's perspective is shaped and limited by one's experience and composition as a particular kind of creature. The Zhuangzi, for instance, says, the radiance of drift and doubt is the sage's only map. This does not mean that the sage, all that the sage does is to doubt, but that doubt about one's current perspective ought to guide one to try to see beyond it, to see what rightness might lie in a perspective that negates what one currently thinks is right. In the first chapter of the Zhuangzi, this point is made playfully by the story of Huizi and the gourds. Zhuangzi's friend and philosophical sparring partner, Huizi, grew huge gourds for which he tried to find a use. He tried using them as water containers, but they were too heavy. He tried using them as ladles, but they were too big. He gave up and smashed them to pieces. Zhuangzi chides his friend for not thinking he could have lashed the gourds together to make a vessel to go floating about on the lakes and streams. Huizi's mind, says Zhuangzi, was clogged up by a bunch of tangled weeds. The point is, everyone has weeds in their minds, preconceptions of what is useful, who has worth, who is right and who is wrong. Furthermore, both the Zhuangzi and Tao Te Ching throw suspicion on the motives of those who lecture others on what is right or appropriate. A playful device, and perhaps a sign of respect employed by the Zhuangzi, is putting his criticism of Confucianism in the mouth of Confucius himself. In chapter 4, Confucius' favorite student, Yan Hui, tells the master that he intends to correct the course of a young ruler who has no regard for the lives of his people. Confucius issues to Yan Hui several cautions about this project, one of which is to examine his own motivations for embarking on this noble-sounding project. Moral excellence, he tells Yan Hui, is, quote, undermined by getting a name for it, and that a good name is most essentially a way for people to one-up each other. So that's why you should watch the motives of those who lecture you, including mine. Zhuangzi has exactly that kind of thing itself. Watch out for what people tell you, including what I'm telling you now. It is commonplace in the traditional Chinese attitude towards Confucianism and Taoism that they are compatible, but the way they're made compatible usually is assigning them different stages of life. Confucianism is for the age of taking responsibility within the human community. The version I've heard is that Taoism is for the time when one ages beyond responsibility and looks to merging with nature again. Shenyang told a different version in which Taoism is consigned to the adolescent period of life when you're all rebellious. Either way, it's somewhat diminishing, I would say. The most productive synthesis, I think, is when Taoism pressures Confucianism to adopt greater epistemic humility about its notions of appropriateness and to be wary of its ambitions to lead through moral nobility. Not only because it might have an overly narrow conception of moral nobility, but because something more unlovely may lie underneath. This interactive blend of Confucianism and Taoism, I think, would yield a more robust conception of harmony that includes the dimensions of indifference, shared understanding, and accommodation, in which the ingredients are more balanced. All right, so now I turn to this part of the paper that has evolved since its first version I read at a Bergeron workshop on harmony and freedom at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. And one major influence on the version you are hearing is Rajeev Bhargava, who has presented this compelling account of a conception of harmony that he finds in the Edicts of King Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE. The situation Ashoka faced, as Bhargava presents it, was of deep disagreements between Pashandas, loosely structured groups possibly identified with a distinct set of teachings of Guru. I shall mention only some of the important differences between these teachings, adhering closely to Bhargava's formulation. So if you have a quarrel with them, ask him. He's right here. Some of these teachings held in the ethical centrality of ritual sacrifice. But among these teachings, there were differences between those that required large, complicated, and expensive staging of rituals, while others held that the real meaning lay in simplicity and economy. I might add there's a kind of parallel tussle in Confucianism along these lines. Some claimed that the main purpose of ritual sacrifice was to propitiate the gods. Others held that the correct, meticulous, flawless performance of the ritual by the Brahmins was sufficient to beget all the goods. Among those who gave karma a central place in their ethics, there were the radical ascetics who evaluated all karma negatively and believed that cessation of all karma, physical and mental motionlessness, was the only way to individual salvation. There were others who argued that karma should be positive and that salvation most depends on other related actions of kindness and compassion, Buddhists, for example. Finally, there was an equally straightforward fight between ritual specialists, Brahmins, and all of those such as the Jains and Buddhists who rejected the ethical significance of ritual sacrifice. For Vedic Brahmanism, it appears, Dharma has less to do with what we owe one another. Neither sacrificial rituals nor gods are invoked for the good of generalized others. Buddhism was pivotal in the birth of transcendental morality. You might have to parse what we mean here by transcendental. The evaluation of the, oops. Okay. It doesn't throw me back to the beginning. Oh, did it? Dharma has less to do with what we own, neither sacrificial rituals or gods are invoked for the good of generalized others. Buddhism was pivotal in the birth of transcendental morality, the transcendental evaluation of the rightness or wrongness of an action in relation to others, and which affects a person's life not in this world alone, but his destiny after death outside this world. This may take some discussion, given the earlier discussion today about transcendental, the meaning of that. By the time of Ashoka, there are two radically differing notions of Dhamma. One, a particular ethic of a single cosmos-oriented, this-worldly self-realization, and the other, a transcendental morality for all concerned, where the which means humans and animals, with right interpersonal conduct. Buddha denied Atman and that the world was identical to the self. So this is just a sample of what Bhargava calls many-layered, incrementally deep conflicts involving different groups who were brought to cooperation through trade and urban living conditions that set them in face-to-face interaction. It is a concrete example of what I earlier referred to as the push and pull of human cooperation. Shared understanding is needed to facilitate cooperation, but cooperation thrives when people can specialize in different activities. And these groups are likely belong to different, in this case, pashandas, with deep disagreements. The task of Ashoka was to develop a way to hold them together, and his edicts about how to lead a good individual and collective life reflect the way he hit upon. Through the seventh edict, Ashoka effectively grants leaders of all pashandas permission to travel freely everywhere in the kingdom to provide them an opportunity to teach and convert each other. Bhargava hypothesizes that the edict addressed severe friction arising from mutual interaction and the attempt to preach one's own ethics to others. Ashoka, it seems, gave assurances to all leaders that they must feel secure everywhere to engage in free interaction and dialogue. Part of the shared understanding is that Vedic Brahmanical ethics would have to be moralized to some degree. The Buddhists near Granthis and Ajivikas, yes, sorry, needed to accept some value in rituals and rites. Ashoka's Edict 9 notes that rituals and ceremonies play an important role in the daily lives of people and are significant on occasions of birth or marriage, of sons and daughters, journey, sickness, and death. The rituals most highly valued had to be ones that concerned acting well towards others. The attempt to give rituals a crucial ethical dimension resonates strongly, of course, with the Confucian conception of rituals. There's further resonance with Confucianism in Ashoka's conception of the good king, who advances the welfare of his people by such measures as planting banyan and mango trees and digging water wells. In the Mangsa, there is a parallel conception of a genuine king who directs the planting of mulberry trees for silk and who sustains natural resources by adapting such measures as regulating the harvesting of timber according to season and prohibiting fish nets with too fine a mesh to prevent catches that undermine the continuing supply. In fact, as I'll point out later, I think there's a tight connection between these measures to advance the welfare of people and bringing about a situation in which deeply disagreeing groups can remain cooperative. It's partly due to the fact that it's much harder to cooperate when you're competing with resources and when people are exploiting that situation to exacerbate the deep disagreements. And that's, of course, not an abstract point I'm making. The 12th edict calls upon all pashandas to restrain their speech. Bhargava explains the significance of this constraint by stressing that this is primarily an oral culture, such that the spoken word carries the entire burden of emotional life. All that uplifts or gets us down, brings us together, or pulls us apart. And this phrase of his. Ashoka's constraints on speech continue to be relevant, actually, when I thought about it, even though we don't think of our contemporary post-industrial societies as oral cultures. But the power of the spoken or tweeted word, I think in general, the word conveyed through media that is so immediate and instantaneous and so far-ranging, I think this has, again, magnified the power of speech when it comes with images that can be broadcast over the whole world. I think, again, we are at these crucial, at the crucial juncture of speech is so powerful. And this power in the US has been used to pull us apart, to implicitly endorse humiliation and violence against women, immigrants, and people of color. This power has made itself felt to shocking effect. Ashoka's call to exercise self-restraint so as to never humiliate others is highly relevant to us now. The other side to restraining one's critique of others is constraining self-glorification. This constraint is certainly a value of Confucianism, and also a warning from Taoistic Confucians that they may nevertheless be engaging in self-glorification when they lecture condescendingly to others. This too has relevance to the contemporary scene, as too many cosmopolitan liberals condescendingly dismiss the concerns of those less educated or less affluent, by exclusively focusing on the objectionable concerns of some of them, treating them as puppets of demagogues or people who don't know their own interests. As Bhargava rightly points out, offending and therefore estranging others undermines one's capacity for mutual interaction and possible influence, for what I would want to call accommodation. Bhargava cites Patrick Olivell's interpretation of Ashoka's edicts not simply as edicts, but as texts designed not only to consolidate his empire, but to articulate a civic religion that regards all Prashandas equally and relies on persuasion and not obedience to law. Bhargava suggests that such a conception of Dhamma is not only a personal morality, but a relational morality for a civil society. Finally, Ashoka advises not only dialogue, but to try practicing the precepts of others, not just imagining what it's like to be in these other shoes, but to try them on and walk around in them. Very shortly, I shall give an example from US history to illustrate how we might come to exchange shoes and even walk together along the same path for a while. Let me address an objection to the conception of harmony thus far sketched. The objection is that dimensions of harmony, these dimensions sit uncomfortably with each other. One is the ideal, the other is the practical. Shared understanding is what we hope for. Accommodation is a concession to reality. These dimensions, it might be thought, are doomed to accompany each other in a state of disharmony. However, without denying the ever-present possibility of disharmony, I want to suggest in what follows that the relationship among these dimensions can be intimate and mutually supportive, especially if the achievement of harmony is an ongoing process, and if the way that the dimensions can be interrelated involves the value of freedom, to speak in the face of conflicting majority consensus or views of the powerful, to pursue one's own path toward the good and meaningful. This is not unlimited freedom. It can support and be supported by shared understanding and accommodation, but it can be in tension with them, as the other two can be with each other. Confronting our deepest disagreements with others is often a matter of confronting the familiar as well as the unfamiliar. If we hold that some means are morally impermissible, even if they are the only available means for promoting the greatest good, we are nevertheless familiar with the kind of consequentialist reasoning that would justify such means. And we may employ such reasoning ourselves up to a point. If we believe that women should have the right to abortions, we typically do not dismiss considerations regarding the value of the potential or actual person, but do accord them weight, even if not the same weight, as those who disagree with us. And as just discussed, those of us who give greater weight to the value of relationship can also care about the protection of individual interests when they come into conflict with those of others. Again, the nature of disagreement is typically like this, where it is the foreground against the background of enough agreement so that we understand each other to be differing over the same subject. Recognizing that we share values may not eliminate disagreement, because we still may assign different priorities to the values we share, or we may differ on how to interpret our shared values. But where shared values are the background of disagreement, disagreeing parties who seek to accommodate each other may choose to foreground where they agree. This is how shared understanding can support accommodation. Disagreeing parties can cooperate on the basis of shared understanding that coexist with their differences. In the US, for example, some pro-life and pro-choice groups in the US have joined together on common projects such as the reduction of unwanted pregnancies. It can go the other way. Accommodation can support shared understanding. Disagreeing parties who accommodate each other may become more inclined to learn from each other and to better understand why they hold the positions they hold. After all, we know that we have enough trouble listening to each other when we disagree. We tend to look for reasons to support our current views and ignore the reasons that undermine those views. We overlook the faults in our own arguments and magnify the faults in the arguments of others. Simply construing an issue in moral terms is enough to generate increased intolerance for and a punitive attitude towards those with beliefs and practices divergent from our own. And the effects increase with the strength of our moral beliefs. Accommodation can help create a different context for a more constructive relationship with disagreeing parties. Within a friendlier social context, belief can change, mitigate, or soften disagreements rather than taking the form of an transient refusal to consider counter-evidence. Consider a phenomenon that John Rawls called slippage, an indeterminacy and fluidity in people's moral beliefs, even some of the most basic beliefs. The key concepts of our most basic beliefs, such as freedom, equality, and community, are subject to multiple interpretations and to further concrete specification at various levels. People often have concepts of this type that are significantly indeterminate with respect to which competing interpretations and further specifications are the right ones. It's not impossible that we could be led to revise or further specify those concepts so that they're not so incompatible with the moral concepts of others we desire to get along with. A dramatic example of the way that shared understanding and accommodation can mutually support one another is provided by the true story of Anne Atwater and C.P. Ellis. Ellis was the exalted Cyclops of the Durham, North Carolina clavern of the Ku Klux Klan. And Atwater was one of the most militant black civil rights activists in Durham. This is where Laura, and my wife, and I live and work, so this story has added meaning to us. To understand the nature of Ellis's and Atwater's initially bitter antagonistic relationship, one must understand the Ku Klux Klan was one of the most virulently racist, white supremacist and white nationalist movements the United States has ever experienced. Given this context, Atwater and Ellis improbably became friends. The context of this transformation was Durham's attempt to desegregate its public schools in the 1970s. Community organizers created a Sherrit, a series of community meetings for promoting communication between black and white parents at newly integrating schools. Ellis started to attend those meetings, not initially motivated by goodwill, but more out of the desire to increase the respectability of the Klan, and to keep an eye, not a benevolent one, on the unfolding desegregation process, to represent the white point of view. The organizational meeting of the Sherrit was the opposite of harmonious, with Ellis and Atwater exchanging racial epithets. In fact, as Anne Atwater revealed, she had a knife in her purse and she was thinking of sticking Ellis in it during one of his tirades. A community organizer named Bill Riddick saw in Ellis something else in addition to the accumulated racial hatreds of the Old South, something he perceived as guileless and essentially honorable. As a result, the organizers of the Sherrit nominated Ellis to co-chair the steering committee of the Sherrit. And much to Ellis's chagrin, Atwater was named the other co-chair. In his retelling the story of what happened, Ellis was pretty self-aware of why he accepted the co-chair. It was his need to matter, to contribute to a community, and to be recognized. He identified that desire as his motivation to call Atwater, to acknowledge that the two of them had huge differences, but to suggest they had responsibility for making the Sherrit work. Ellis and Atwater had a dinner meeting to see how they could do this. After years of viewing Atwater as a symbol of everything he hated about African Americans, Ellis was overwhelmed by the revelation that, quote, she was capable of sitting in a chair in a restaurant and eating food. He was confronted with the brute fact that it's often the basis of shared further understanding, the ordinary, shared humanness of someone previously perceived as an enemy. As their partnership on school desegregation developed, Atwater humorously affirmed her role of protecting Ellis when he went to school meetings in black neighborhoods. At one point, she stopped some students from tearing down an exhibit of Klan literature that Ellis had set up at a school fair. What began as a modus vivendi began to take shape as accommodation. Factors besides Ellis's desire for community included the fact that African Americans extended gestures of accommodation to Ellis during that first organizational meeting. Howard Clement, an African American civil rights activist, got up at the meeting and said he was glad Ellis came to the meeting because Ellis was the most honest man there. He even said he and Ellis were brothers because they had common concerns about their children. I might add that this gesture by Clemens caused some consternation in the African American community, including in his own father, who gave him some grief about that. Even after the exchange of racial epithets, several African Americans went up to Ellis after the meeting adjourned and offered to shake his hand. Ellis was so shocked he was unable to reciprocate. But that experience came to be juxtaposed in his mind with another one in which a white city councilman crossed the street to avoid having to greet him, Ellis, in public, even though the two of them had been having telephone conversations and meeting privately about the African American problem. This brought home to Ellis that he was good enough to be used by the respectable white establishment, but not good enough to be seen in public with. Accommodation developed into shared understanding. At a meeting of the Sheriff, Ellis is struck by a black parent's protest that teachers and school administration treated her children as if they were stupid troublemakers. He had been about to say this very same thing about his own children, that they had been treated as poor white trash. This experience happened repeatedly throughout the day, and Ellis was stunned to hear again and again his own concerns coming from the others' mouths. When arguments about kids erupted at school, it was the working class children, black and white, who were always blamed and punished. Gray Davidson said in his book about this story. This led Atwater and Ellis to talking about how hard it was to raise children without much money, how they were always having to tell their kids that they were just as good as kids from middle-class homes, to never be ashamed of who they were. At the same time, Atwater and Ellis confessed to each other that they had to hide their own shame about not being better providers. They talked about the teachers never letting their kids forget that they came from impoverished households. Black and white parents at the Sheriff turned to making recommendations to the school board as to how their children could be treated more fairly. Because Ellis and Atwater were cooperating with each other, they did face criticism and shunning from some members of their respective communities. And on the last night of the Sheriff, Ellis publicly renounced the Klan and tore up his membership card. Let me go back to Bhargava's interpretation of the path to Ashokan harmony and relate that to the Ellis-Atwater story. These two people not only understood each other better, what it was like to be in each other's shoes, but walked in each other's shoes. Atwater defended Ellis's attempt to display Klan literature. Ellis, in the end, tore up his Klan membership card. Doing that helped to walk the same path together in friendship and common project, that of care and advocacy for their children. Now, of course, I will not say that we will frequently encounter such dramatic interchange between accommodation and shared understanding. But certainly it is an inspiration for less daunting interchanges we can accomplish much more frequently. Let me now make a case for a positive relationship between harmony and freedom. When harmony is conceived at least partly as a valuing of difference, freedom for the individual can play a crucial role. Rather, the kind of freedom includes freedom of expression and freedom to explore one's interests, strengths, and skills, to develop them. To get mutual exchange and greater understanding between those who disagree, we need, as Ashoka perceived, to relax pressures to conform to whatever prevailing consensus there is. The value of freedom can pull us in the direction of relaxing restrictions on speech, and even encouraging it from those who tend to be silent or who are being silenced by others. The positive relationship, however, is not simple. At the same time, constraint on freedom can be justified to promote or protect harmony as shared agreement on the value of relationships of mutual concern and trust. Speech might need to be restricted in cases where it seriously threatens basic forms of shared understanding that form part of the framework for mutual trust. Like every one of our treasured values, freedom can pull us in contrary directions. In this case, the direction of restricting speech of those who would do the silencing through intimidation and through creating a culture of hatred for those who they wish to silence. And sometimes historical events tilt the weight in favor of judgment of restriction. For example, the illegality of Holocaust denial in many European countries. And sometimes acts of intimidation so egregious that they clearly merit the punishment of law. As in the case of students at the University of Mississippi in the United States, who hung a noose and draped the Confederate battle flag around the statue of James Meredith, the university's first black student. The danger is that those who would restrict speech to defend intimidators against intimidators risk becoming intimidators themselves. The current debate in the on U.S. college campuses regarding institutional policing against microaggressions highlights both kinds of considerations rooted in freedom. The fact is that women and people of color have long been intimidated and silenced by remarks that are often not intended to have these effects, but that are embedded in the culture and absorbed by everyone. But when the cuts and slights are relatively subtle and open to reasonable interpretive debate, those who wish to defend the vulnerable can become intimidators. And social media, apart from any institutional punishment, can have life-changing consequences for the perceived offenders. Again, the power of social media. Such considerations weigh in favor of restricting or punishing speech only in egregious cases or for chronic offenders. But it is in the Confucian spirit of harmony to look for positive ways of addressing the problem, of welcoming those who represent difference and challenge to orthodoxy, and of countering those who they exclude. There is, of course, the answer, often given, that rightful speech counters wrongful speech. But we would do well to try to promote a more hospitable culture to listening to right speech. I think that Confucian Li and Ashoka's conception of rituals that have been embedded in an ethical framework are a necessary long-term strategy, part of it, for addressing the challenge of encouraging the inclusion of difference in harmony. Again, not the total answer, but part of it. The part that recognizes how our responses to others are shaped by cultural habits going deep into the bone. I think this is one of the deep insights of Confucianism. In 2.3, Annexe, the master said, "Lead the people with administrative injunctions and keep them orderly with penal law, and they will avoid punishments but will be without a sense of shame. Lead them with excellence and keep them orderly through observing ritual propriety, and they will develop a sense of shame and moreover will order themselves." Compare this to Ashoka's appreciation for the importance of rituals that have the ethical dimension of expressing goodwill towards others. The Chinese word li is usually translated as ritual propriety, and indeed it does cover observing ritual in our more contemporary sense. Ceremonies that mark major life passages such as death, coming of age, marriage, and death. Birth, coming of age, marriage, and death. But li also constitute a kind of social grammar, norms and practices that specify mutually respectful behavior in everyday social interaction and discourse. Li, in the Confucian sense, includes ceremonies and social grammar, such as the way one begins and ends an archery competition by bowing and making one's way for one's competitors, and the custom of serving losers so-called penalty drinks. That's what they got for losing. Writing on Xunzi's conception of li, Daniel Bell has pointed out that rituals that specify the way people higher up in hierarchies can function of reminding them, have the function of reminding them of their responsibilities to people lower in the hierarchy, reminding them of the humanity of those lower down. Those rituals in particular that promote a kind of friendly social interaction outside the structures of hierarchy in the institutions in question. The mindful performance of such li is a way for people to enact and strengthen dispositions towards effective attitudes of care and respect. When rituals such as this are woven into our daily life and our institutions, They provide opportunities to affirm, enact, and strengthen. Dispositions to use one's freedom to speak responsibly and with due concern for the ones who might be criticizing, ones we might be criticizing, to enact Ashokan self-restraint with regard to criticizing others and glorifying oneself. This strategy does not have many of the drawbacks of legally restricting and punishing those perceived as intimidators or silencers. But are we too diverse in our contemporary societies to accomplish even a harmony that accommodates difference? The sociologist Robert Putnam's 2007 study provides a measure of sobering confirmation for the worry that ethically and racially diverse communities will tend to be lower in the social goods comprising social capital, such as diversity and trust. However, Putnam does not think that it's diversity alone that undermines social capital. He cites contention over limited resources as a primary factor in divisiveness. And again, that is why Mencius's recommendations as king and Ashoka's actions of advancing the welfare of his subjects are very much a necessary part of promoting harmony. Putnam also observes, and this is very much congenial to a Confucian perspective, that a century ago shared identities were promoted within, quote, community centers, athletic fields, and schools, that they were among the most efficacious instruments for incorporating new immigrants, and that we need to reinvest in such places and activities once again, enabling us all to become comfortable with diversity. I agree, we need to repurpose critical institutions where people of diverse backgrounds meet and can join in common purpose, as the story of Ellis and Atwater and the desegregation of Durham public schools illustrates. The preliminary findings of a current study in the U.S. by social scientists point to the quality and friendliness of the interaction between groups in Philadelphia and Atlanta as conducive to trust and civic engagement in workplaces, neighborhoods, and public spaces. Among two immigrant groups, Mexicans and South Asians, and two native-born groups of whites and blacks, trust increased with greater face-to-face contact, and there were secondary transfer effects in the sense that friendly contact with one group increased trust in other groups. Schools distribute learning, skills, goods, and opportunities to children that greatly matter to their families. Institutions where people have a big stake are far more likely to attract participation and effective investment. Rituals and social grammar deployed at such sites of interaction between diverse groups can make for friendly contact. At events such as dinners and school fairs and carnivals for students, families and teachers are far less likely to be purely for show and more likely to be interwoven with the goods and opportunities that are afforded by institutions. They can be sites where diverse groups can introduce their own rituals and social grammar to others. Teachers are critical for introducing and sustaining a social grammar for the classroom and interactions between students of diverse backgrounds. In summary, ritual and social grammar can aid us in reconciling harmony and freedom by helping us to avoid frequent resort to punishment and suppression of those who seek to exclude difference. Without a sense of relationship to diverse others, a sense of shared fate with them, we risk persecution of those identified as threats by virtue of religion, ethnicity, or nation of origin. Let me conclude with one other point about rituals and other forms of social grammar. They need not be conveyances of pure sweetness and light. They may be vehicles of respectful protest, ceremonial protest of injustice and mistreatment from authorities and others in the larger societies. These protests may implicitly appeal to shared understandings. Examples from American history include the sit-ins at lunch counters and other public places to protest racial segregation in the American South during the Civil Rights Movement. The violation of segregation law and willingness to be arrested was an active appeal to the consciences of the white majority. It's a city, I believe in one of the first in Greensboro, North Carolina. And this relates to the following scene. Because key figures in the American Civil Rights Movement, including John Haynes Holmes, beginning in the 1920s, Du Bois, and Martin Luther King Jr. were deeply influenced by Gandhi, including his leadership of the Salt March to protest the British tax on salt. That protest was an inspiration for marches for civil rights and sit-ins at whites-only eating establishments and the whites-only section of buses to protest segregation. And when you think about it, acts, ritual ceremonies can begin with individuals who perform something dramatic and compelling. And then they influence other people and say, we can do this too. And they adopt that vocabulary, that social grammar, and it becomes a customary practice. In this case, customary practice of protest, but peaceful and challenging at the same time. It's a way of challenging this diversity in a way that assures that it does not break apart the society in which there is this protest. There are acts of protest that have a kind of ritual form and have emerged or spun off from rituals of loyalty. They can be used to express a conception of loyalty that affirms commitment to one's country's capacity to live up to its values, even if it falls short correctly. Consider the kneeling of African American football players and then increasingly other athletes and white athletes in sympathy with them that affirm that this was in protest of the killing of African Americans by police officers. But such an act would not have the ritual meaning it has were it not for the standard form of pledging allegiance at the start of sports games, which is to stand facing the flag. Of course, I don't deny we are at some distance from what Master Kung might have identified as properly behavior. But there are protests that make use of ritual and social grammar in the Confucian tradition, and so I tell this final story to end. Annexe 1720 tells us the following about the way in which the master conveys his disapproval for a man of influence who sought to have a meeting with him. The master conveys the message through violating a customary norm of social grammar. Liu Bei saw a meeting with Confucius, but Confucius declined to entertain him, feigning illness. Just as the envoy carrying the message was about to depart, Confucius got up his lute and sang, making sure that the messenger heard him. So that's my recipe for harmonious soup. I have added some spicy hot protest peppers at the end, and even if soup is not a big item in the Indian cuisine, I hope you find it tasty, but in any case I will benefit from your agreement and disagreement.